I've been a pastor in Utah for over 30 years, and I was born and raised in the Mormon Church. So I'd like to share with you some things I've learned about living in Utah. If you're watching this, then there's a good chance that you're new to Utah, or perhaps you're new to this church and you're wondering how we relate to the faith that's all around us here in Utah. Now, either way, we've prepared this series to encourage you and to explore together how to live as a positive person of faith in the midst of this religious environment. Because in case you haven't noticed, in Utah, Christians live in a culture that's dominated by a different faith. America on the whole is a land of increasing pluralism and diversity, but here in Utah, our culture is dominated by a single religion. Almost 70% of Utah's residents are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as the LDS Church. We call them Mormons. And all the other faiths combined account for less than 10% of the population of Utah. Now, the town or the community, the neighborhood where you live might be more or less than that, but the effect is generally the same, that Mormonism and its influence are just a lot like the air that we breathe. And Latter-day Saints have a lot of influence in government, politics, in business, in education. And given that reality, in light of that, then here's the point of our series, that as a Christian living in Utah, you can not only survive, but you can thrive. People who are new here in Utah quickly notice the differences, and a lot of people adopt the attitude they're just going to hunker down and survive until they can find their way out of the state. But we want to encourage you to have a more hopeful experience than that. We believe that you can help have a positive influence for Jesus Christ here in Utah, because the fact is Mormonism is changing. There are more opportunities to share the good news of Christ and to have spiritual conversations with people in Mormonism than there ever have been in the past. So we want to encourage you to partner up with your church to help to share the good news of God's grace that Mormon people need to hear. In fact, everybody needs to hear. And this series is designed to kind of help you learn the ropes. So we're going to start with a very important perspective on attitude. We're going to be positive. We have a positive message for our LDS neighbors. Our message is that salvation comes by God's grace alone, through faith alone, in Jesus Christ alone, and we know this by the Bible alone. Now, that immediately creates a tension because Mormonism represents what the Bible calls a different gospel. And we read about that in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. You happily put up with whatever anyone tells you, even if they preach a different Jesus than the one we preach, or a different kind of spirit than the one you received, or a different kind of gospel than the one you believed. Now, as we're going to see in the next lesson, our beliefs and Mormon beliefs stand in direct opposition to each other. And that creates a tension, partly because Mormons can be very sensitive to critique. And if we point out differences and disagreements, they might feel like we're attacking the church that they love. But the other part of the tension is that Mormons are actually committed to converting you to their version of the gospel. That makes religion sometimes a sensitive subject to talk about here in Utah. And for this reason, we choose to talk about Mormonism with an attitude of respect. And again, our message is positive, not negative. It's a message of God's life-changing grace through Jesus Christ. Our message is not about what's wrong with Mormonism. Now, there's plenty of things that are wrong with Mormonism from a biblical and historical perspective, but that's not the approach that we take. And we learn that from the Bible in 1 Peter chapter 3. If someone asks you about your hope as a believer, always be ready to explain it, but do this in a gentle and respectful way. So Peter's saying that how we speak is just as important as what we say. We have a message of hope that we convey with gentleness and respect. And we see a biblical example of that in Acts chapter 19. The message of Christ came powerfully to the city of Ephesus, and it was so life-changing and transforming that so many people were changed, embracing the message of Christ, that it completely changed the economy of the city, and the whole town was put into an uproar. And we're going to see what the leaders of the town said in response to all these changes in Acts chapter 19, verse 37. The leader of the city said to the crowds, "You have brought these men here, but they have stolen nothing from the temple and have not spoken against our goddess." So the message of Jesus made a powerful impact in the city of Ephesus, but it happened without the Christians speaking derisively or negatively about the local religion. Now, we know there's plenty of differences, and we're not going to minimize those differences between the true gospel and the false gospel. But what good does it do us if our LDS neighbors get defensive and feel persecuted and they stop listening? Or what good does it do if somebody actually even leaves the Mormon church, they become convinced that it's false, but they don't come to a living faith in Jesus Christ? That's why we want to interact with Mormonism with a positive attitude. But next, along those same lines, we want to interact with Mormon neighbors with wisdom and sensitivity. Here's what I mean by that. First of all, we're going to represent the beliefs of our neighbors accurately and fairly. We're not going to create a caricature or a straw man kind of thing and knock it down. Secondly, we're going to interact with Latter-day Saints as real people, not just as stereotypes. And third, we're not going to be involved in bad-mouthing or complaining about Latter-day Saint culture, society, LDS people. In short, we want to treat them the way that we would hope to be treated ourselves by others. Now, part of that wisdom and sensitivity is also that we're going to interact with Mormonism as a culture, not just as a religion or a system of beliefs, because people are more than just what they believe. Mormonism is entire way of living, entire identity. As one scholar has said, like Judaism, Mormonism is a religion that has become a people. And so that's why we choose to interact with them with wisdom and sensitivity. Now, we know that sharing good news with Latter-day Saints is challenging, but it's also hopeful. There are a number of factors that make it challenging to share our faith with Latter-day Saints. First of all, even though we share a lot of the same moral values and behavior and lifestyle are very similar, the underlying worldview beneath those values is very, very different, as we began to point out earlier in this lesson. And then secondly, related to that, there's often a great deal of confusion about terminology because Mormons use a lot of the same language that traditional Christians use, but they use it with very different meanings. So it's easy to be confused as we try to communicate together. And then what's more, Mormonism provides a strong legacy, a deeply rooted history that makes it very hard for people raised in Mormonism to change. Mormonism provides for a lot of people's needs, and Mormons are taught to be self-sufficient and capable, and that makes them often not interested in the message of God's grace. But in spite of those challenges, there's great hope because we see a lot of interesting things happening in Utah that give us hope for the message of the gospel. We see a lot of Latter-day Saints are having deep and disturbing questions about the validity of their faith, about their truth claims and the history of Mormonism that they were raised to believe was true. And we see that a lot of people on the cultural fringes of Mormonism are moving farther away from Mormonism rather than back into it. And the fact is that hundreds and hundreds of people from a Mormon background are coming to a new faith, a biblical faith in Jesus Christ. A survey done a couple years ago shows that out of all the people that were raised Mormon, that 30% of them leave the Mormon faith. And about half of those find a new spiritual home in a traditional biblical kind of congregation. And so there's hope and encouragement. In fact, at our church, about a third of our congregation are former Latter-day Saints. That's because we practice this sensitive and wise approach, that we tell the truth but without attacking, and we give people time. We try to create a safe place for the journey. And so many people have found a home here at our church. And that's why we say even though it's challenging to share faith with Latter-day Saints, there's still hope. Now, next week, we're going to look at the core Mormon beliefs and some of the unique features of LDS culture so that we can better understand the people who are our neighbors.